to move all over the place today, Sister Tanya. Yeah, to give you exercise. Well, praise the Lord. Let's all stand before the Lord. Thank you, Jesus. Let's just close our eyes, lift our hands toward heaven. Let's talk to the Lord right now. Jesus, there's a message you want delivered to your children today, and I'm going to do the very best I can. But, Lord, I'm asking that you open their heart, mind, and understanding, open their ears to hear the word of God, and then internalize it like a seed and let it grow, that it might produce 30, 60, and 100-fold. But, Lord, right now, I'm asking you to bless this congregation, bless everyone who's watching online, that they may get something from this message, the message that you want them to hear. And everybody says, you may be seated in his presence. All right, as you know, this is the third week in our third series for the year. This whole series is on Elijah and Elisha. And so today's lesson, 3.3, is going to be success in succession, the passing on of the mantle from one to another. And there's a lot of different stories in here we're going to talk about, but really it's all pretty good. Now we know, all through history you've seen this, where one generation will build up wealth and build up power and build up, even an empire. I mean, I have an empire. It's 2 lots out in Bulls Harbor, but that's my empire. That's the land that God gave me. And so you've seen it time and time again where families will build all this up, and when they turn over to the next generation, they squander it. I mean, literally, they squander all the money, they squander the land, they squander the businesses to the point where there is nothing left. And I've seen it time and time again. And so that's called generational degeneration. And that's a term the fancy psychologists and sociologists have come up with, generational degeneration. It's like the laws of thermodynamics, where you get a closed system, it doesn't get better. It doesn't become more efficient. It gets less efficient, almost to the point where the system itself fails. And we see that time and time again. And that's the laws of thermodynamics. You can't break those. It's like gravity. Even in Scripture, if you think about it, and I wrote some of these down. Exodus 1:8 says, "And there arose a king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." So you're talking about one of the greatest men that saved Egypt and saved the known world at the time. That there was a famine for 7 years, and everybody in the known world was going to Egypt because there was grain there, because Joseph was smart enough to set some things aside for the rainy day. This was a rainy day fund for 7 years. And so Joseph knew what was coming, set up in order to save the known world, including all of his relatives that came down from the land of Canaan. What happened to that Pharaoh? How come he didn't know Joseph? How come the Pharaoh that was with Joseph didn't say, hey, this guy's pretty special, and everybody that's associated with him is special, treat them with kid gloves? No. There arose a king that knew not Joseph, and what did he do? Turned the Hebrews into slaves and enslaved them for approximately 400 years. 1 Samuel 2:12, the sons of Eli knew not the Lord. You're talking the second to the last of the judges. Eli had 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These guys were so corrupt, they would take the best of the meat that was being sacrificed to the Lord for themselves. They turned the house of God into their own private brothel. And so because of that, God killed them. And that's when Samuel came up as the last of the prophets. Judges 2:7. Joshua dies. Joshua, who was in Egypt, went with Moses to Mount Sinai, saw him get all this stuff from God, saw the miracles, saw the everything, and then followed Moses 40 years in the desert. And as soon as he died, a generation grew up that knew not the Lord. You're talking about miracle after miracle after miracle. And a generation grew up as soon as Joshua died who knew not the Lord. That tells me there was a break in communication somewhere in this generational degeneration. They knew not the Lord. So what happened then? Well, God sent judges to try and fix them. You think, well, that's all Old Testament stuff, Brother Henscheid. It doesn't count. Well, let me tell you something. In the New Testament, Galatians says the people, this is Paul talking to the church at Galatia, saying, the people knew not the Lord and turned toward idolatry and witchcraft and everything else. You're talking about they spoke to people who walked with Jesus, talked with Jesus, ate next to him, probably slept around the campfire next to him, heard all of the messages, saw all the miracles, did all the stuff, and all of a sudden, they knew not God? I've seen it in our time. I've seen it in our own churches, where you get a church, vibrant, worshipful church. Pastor will turn it over to his son, and before you know it, the church fails. Now, before you get all doom and gloom, that is an exception. That is not the norm. I've seen some absolutely powerful churches that were turned over to the pastor's son, and that's when it lit on fire and went berserk for the God. And it grew and grew and grew to the point where they had either split the churches out because they couldn't handle that many people, or they started a bunch of daughter works in the area. So I've seen both sides. I'm just saying that in a lot of cases, you need to be very careful about this generational degeneration, where you need to make sure the next generation is prepared for what's coming for them. So, I want to talk today about a very special case, and that's Alexander the Great. Now, this is a statue that's in Edinburgh, Scotland, showing Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great conquered all of the known world. He was a Greek, obviously. Conquered all of the known world by the time he was 32 years old. Now, he didn't do that on his own. He got an education from his father, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But Alexander the Great, they call him the Great because he was. He was proficient in combat. When he was going up against the Persians, he found ways to move his army twice as fast through the countryside as the Persians. He could literally outrun them. He could literally go around them and stop them, their progress. He could get on both sides of them. He found ways of teaching his soldiers how to inflate the packs they carried so they could float down rivers or around on the ocean to get around his enemy to conquer them. He was innovative. But he wasn't just born with this. So, he had a father that was Philip of Macedon, King Philip, who taught him, who wanted to make sure he had the right knowledge, skills, and abilities to be a conqueror of lands and people. Now, one of the things that Alexander did, and that's what you're looking up here, that's his horse, Bucephalus. He sees this black stallion that nobody could break. Now, I was born and raised in Texas. What do? You go up there and you manhandle the goofy thing, you get on it, even if you have to duct tape your legs to it, whatever you got to do to stay on it, until finally the horse realizes this guy's not getting off, and that's how they start to get broke. Alexander the Great didn't do that. He watched him. Instead of just jumping out there and trying to conquer, he watched them and realized this horse, Bucephalus, was afraid of his shadow. It would freak him out. So he positioned the horse so he couldn't see his shadow. And that's when he broke him. And that's the horse he used in many of the battles that he fought until he died at the age of 32. When Bucephalus died, he was buried with full military honors because of the number of battles and the successes they had fighting these battles. So here's this horse getting full military honors. Interesting. So let's go back to Philip. Philip of Macedon, King Philip, said, you know, I want my son to have the best education possible. Now, a lot of people have heard of Plato, Greek philosopher. One of his students was, Socrates, whose student was Plato. One of Plato's students was Aristotle. That's who King Philip got to teach his son. So he grabbed one of the greatest minds on the earth at the time, at least in the Grecian Hellenistic world, and that's who he wanted to teach his son, because he wanted his son to have a very, very good education. And so Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. While Alexander was with King Philip out in the field, he learned as much as he could from him. Philip demonstrated all of these different military tactics and things like that. Alexander picked up on it. But when you look at what King Philip did and you look at what Alexander the Great did, there's a huge difference. Alexander the Great far exceeded anything that his father Philip did. So, going back to what today's lesson is about. This whole series is about Elijah and Elisha. And so, Elijah served as the forerunner of Elisha, just as John the Baptist was the forerunner of Jesus. So God used Elijah with many, many absolute miracles. And there were 7 of them associated with Elijah. Powerful ones, raising that child from the dead, all sorts of things. And so, as we go through this morning's study and we see Elisha and Elijah, we see that Elijah had some issues, we'll call it that. I mean, we studied Mount Carmel. We had Brother Caleb and Sister Erin up here talking about, the different things that was happening with Elijah. And you look at the powerful, incredible victory won on Mount Carmel against the 450 prophets of Baal. Those were associated with Ahab. The 400 prophets of the Grove, those were associated with the worship of Ashtoreth, which was Jezebel's goddess. And so we see Elijah doing all of this, and then because Jezebel writes a letter that says, hey, I'm just not happy with what you did. So by tomorrow, you're going to be like those prophets. You're going to be dead. Now, you would think if you called fire from heaven and you did all these miraculous things and then whipped up on 850 guys, you might get a big head. What did Elijah do? Ran for the hills. Ran as far south as he could go and kept running till he ended up in a cave. Okay. So now he's in a cave, almost to the point of despairing of his life. Lord, I'm the only one left. You might as well just kill me too. Interesting. Now, God, in his infinite wisdom, knew Elijah's heart. That Elijah had given up everything to be a servant of the Lord. And so because of that, he had to be very demonstrative with his message. So here's a big earthquake. But he told them, I'm not in the earthquake. Here's a big wind. I'm not in the wind. Here's a fire. I'm not in the fire. So in this still small voice, he talks to him and says, what are you doing here? What are you doing? I have 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal or kissed him. Obviously kissing the statue. And so God also knew Elijah is not going to live forever. And while he is continuing his journey that God has put him on, he knew he needed someone to mentor. He knew he needed someone to be a companion with him, that he had been alone most of his life, and so he needed someone to be with him. And so he chose Elisha. And so he tells Elijah, go to this place, you'll see Elisha, that's who I want you to anoint. So he finds him, and Elisha is just doing his dad's business. Now remember, back in those days, Jesus was a carpenter because Joseph was a carpenter. Elisha was a farmer because his dad was a farmer. So what do farmers do? They're out there plowing. And he had 12 yoke of oxen. I don't know what kind of rocky land they were plowing up, but if you have 12 yoke of oxen, now I'm assuming there's just one plow. It might have been 12 plows, but there were 12 yoke of oxen. That's 24. So he had a pretty big farm. And so Elijah doesn't say a word, walks up to him, takes his mantle off, puts the mantle on top of Elisha, and just stands there. Now, Elisha must have felt a lightning bolt from heaven through his spine when that thing touched him, because he immediately said, hey, I'm with you. But is it okay if I go and say goodbye to my mom and dad? He said, what have I done to you? Go. Something must have stopped Elisha, because he didn't go back to say goodbye to his mother and father. He said it immediately killed one yoke of oxen, 2 oxen, prepared the meal for the people, and said, I'm ready, let's go. From that point on, they were inseparable. And so Elisha was there to be a companion to Elijah, and Elijah still continued on doing what God told him to do. So, I think, I keep thinking about this generational degeneration. And I can see Elijah looking at Elisha, and he knew something was special. God must have seen Elisha's heart, that once he got plugged in, he was totally plugged in. You know, we need to be the same way. We need to, when we start this path with God, when we start this journey, we need to be wholehearted into it with our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength. We need to just totally be abandoned to this cause. And so it gets to the point where Elijah is getting ready to be taken. He knew it. And so he tried 3 times to tell Elisha, just stay here. Just go back. Just go. Nope, I'm not going anywhere. But you need to go back. This is going to be the end of our relationship. Nope, I'm not going back. 3 times he tried. He says, nope, I'm not going back. And so he's walking with him the whole time. So callings, I guess, mean you give something up. Always. First of all, you don't do anything for God unless you're called. If you try doing it on your own power, you're in big trouble. So once God calls you, it requires you to give up something. And it's like with Elisha. He had to give up farming. He had to give up being with his family and growing up in the things he's accustomed to and everything else. Think about when Jesus walked along the shore of Galilee and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing?" "Fishing." "I'll make you fishers of men. Follow me." And he turns around and walks away. So there's the choice. We can stay in our comfort zone of fishing, fixing our nets and doing our thing, or we can abandon all of that and follow Jesus. I don't know how many people Jesus actually called. The Bible doesn't say. He might have called dozens and dozens until he found Peter, James, John, and Andrew. And they said, okay. They dropped everything and followed him. And they became apostles because of that. And so we need to be the same way. When God calls us, we need to, I'm not saying you have to give up everything. I'm just saying that when God tells you, give up this, give up that, do this, do that, we need to do it with our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, because that is what is going to help the kingdom of heaven. It may not help you because you're giving up a lot of things, but it will help the kingdom of heaven. And that's the priority as far as the Lord is concerned. So when he asks you to give something up, is it going to hurt you? Maybe for a short time, but our treasure's not down here. If you gave up absolutely everything and make it to heaven, you win. If you give up part of this and part of that because you want to hang on to this, if you're going to straddle the line, what did the Lord say? What did he say in Revelation? He said, you're not hot or cold, you're lukewarm. And because you're lukewarm, I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. Spewing you out of my mouth is not a good terminology for, hey, you're with me. No, it's not. And I've had people say, well, at least if you're lukewarm, you're part with the Lord. Doesn't that count for something? No, it doesn't with God. And they'd ask me why, and I'd say, because you're straddling the fence. You make no difference. I'll put it that way. If you're lukewarm, you're not making a difference in the kingdom of heaven, because you're a little bit hot, but then you start getting a little cold, and people that were thinking, okay, this is the way, well, now look at him. Now he's cold. Now he's hot. Now he's cold. You're not making a difference. That's why you're no good to the Lord. I would rather have you cold, absolutely against it. Now I know what not to do. And so Elisha had already proved himself to be tenacious in his nature of being a farmer. He did it with all of his might. And now that he's with Elijah, he's doing the same thing. He's being tenacious. He's giving everything he's got to be part of this team, part of this Elisha team. And so Elijah is getting ready to leave. And I can imagine that this was going to be traumatic. In 2 Kings, it mentions the sons of the prophet came out to meet Elisha. And Amos is famous for saying, well, I'm neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet. What does that mean? That means there was an organization of, or a school of prophets, if you want to call it that. It was a union. You can't just say you're part of it. You're either in that organization or you're not. Amos was not. That's why he was saying it that way. I'm not part of that. Elisha wasn't part of that. So when the school of the prophets came up, the sons of the prophets, and said, hey, don't you understand what's going to be coming up here soon? He said, I know, keep your peace. These were the sons of the prophets, and yet they didn't even go across the Jordan for when Elijah was going to be taken from them. They sat up on a hillside and watched. We have a lot of people in our churches that are spectators, and I'm not putting them down. They're showing up to church, okay, but they're not wholly involved. you're in the lukewarm category. You're not cold, you showed up, but you're not hot either. And so because of that, the Lord said he's going to spew you out of his mouth. That's not a good thing. So these sons of the prophets are sitting up on a hill. They're spectators. They're watching the show. And so they walk up to the Jordan. We all know the story. They walk up to the Jordan, and they're getting ready to go across, and Elijah takes off his mantle, wraps it around his arm, and flings it down at the river, and the river parts. Now, I can imagine Elisha watching this. That hadn't happened before. Of course, every day with Elijah was probably a new thing. This is a new thing. So they walk across the Jordan. They're on the other side now. The school of the prophets are watching them, the sons of the prophets. And he tries again. Man, you need to go back. I'm not going back. I'm not going anywhere. Why are you sticking with me? I want a double portion of your spirit. Now, I'm sure Elijah, and he even said that's a hard thing. But if you see me taken away, God will give you a double portion of my spirit. Okay. I mean, he already proved I'm not going anywhere. He told him 3 times, go back. Nope, I'm not going anywhere. Okay, if you see me taken away, you'll get it. Great. I'm happy. So a chariot of fire comes, takes up Elijah, gone. And the mantle falls, and Elisha picks it up. Now, he might have been thrilled for a second about there's the mantle, the one that touched my shoulders, that changed my life, the trajectory of my entire existence. But then he started thinking, my mentor's gone. The guy that taught me everything about God, the one that showed me so many miracles. And he picks up the mantle, and he is just probably destitute inside. And he's walking back to the Jordan. Jordan's flowing. And so he wraps it up, and he did just like Elijah did. He throws it down and says, where is the God of Elijah? And God parted the Jordan River, and he walked across, showing him that I was the God of Elijah. Now I'm the God of Elisha. Sometimes I wish the Bible wouldn't make them so similar, side by side. I've only messed that up like 3 times so far, but bear with me. I'm an old guy, so, you know. So he wanted a double portion. What's interesting is there are 7 recorded miracles for Elijah. And there are 14 recorded miracles for Elisha. So not only did he get a double portion, he got a double portion of the number of miracles that's going to be performed. Now what's interesting is the 14th one was after Elisha died. The last miracle. Now I don't know, maybe Elisha's going, hey, wait a minute, in order to have a double portion, I need one more miracle. I've only had 13. And then he dies. I don't know if God told him, I got you, don't worry. Because the 14th miracle is when the enemy was coming up and they were burying the dead, and they took this dead man's body and threw it into a cave because the enemy was coming. And as soon as that body touched the bones of Elisha, it was resurrected. Now both Elijah and Elisha had resurrection already checked off on their list. The widow women's sons. So he got a double resurrection because Elisha had 2 and Elijah had 1. Now I can imagine one of the issues that we have with this generational degeneration is there starts to be competition between generations. That the older generation feels threatened. And the younger generation is saying, hey, you're holding me back, you know. Where in reality, the older generation is probably watching and testing the younger generation to make sure that they're ready, and maybe, you know, test them in this area and that area and the other area to make sure they're ready and they're strong enough and everything else, because when we pass away, you're it. I dare say right now, part of the trouble that's going on in the world today is the new generation is not ready. Now, this is from an older generation saying, you young whippersnapper, you're green, you know, you're green and you're wet behind the ears. You're not ready for this world. And the younger generation says, I can't wait for you guys to die and get out of the way so we can do our thing. I mean, how many times has that happened since Adam and Eve? A lot. So, the same thing happened here. The same thing happened with all of this. So, what's interesting is Elijah and Elisha never had that kind of, you know, headbutting. Elisha knew he was called of God. He felt the mantle on his shoulder. He felt the bolt of lightning from heaven. But Elijah encouraged, taught, and continued teaching. He did not butt head with him thinking, oh, that a young punk Elisha is trying to take all the glory. Elisha never did that. He was very submitted to his mentor. And so I think one of the things that is lacking in the younger generation a lot of times is patience. They want it now. I mean, I can remember the story of the prodigal son. I know I should probably wait until you're dead, but Dad, I want my stuff now. And the son gave it to him. And what happened? Generational degeneration. He squandered all of it to the point where he was destitute and feeding swine, which in a Jewish world was pretty verboten. And so because of that, he didn't have patience. And look at the results. That happens to all of us at times where we get impatient. We get impatient with the pace that God has us on. And so because of that, you know, we try to get something before we're ready. Now, I think what the key idea behind all of this is we need to trust those that are over us on our path, especially when it comes to God. When it comes to God, we all have spiritual leaders, hopefully mom and dad, but you know, my wife and I are first generation. We were in another religion our whole life. And so we have to trust the spiritual leaders God put in our path. And mom and dad wasn't it. We need to trust our pastor, that he has our best interests in heart. I mean, if you go up to the pastor and say, I think I'm going to be a missionary to Zimbabwe. Okay. I can see Pastor Ritter's wheels turning now going, okay, how many Bible studies are you doing right now? Well, none. Okay. Well, how many people have you won to the Lord? Well, none yet, but I'm going to go to Zimbabwe and I'm going to win a bunch. Have you ever been out of Monroe? Well, we went to Toledo once. Okay. Well, we're going to pray about this. I mean, his job isn't to crush anybody. That may be the vision God gave him. But for right now, let's pray about it. Let's get you into some Bible studies. Let's get you out on the street. And if you can't preach on the streets of Monroe, where they don't have guys with guns ready to kill you because you're daring to have a Bible and tell somebody about Jesus, let's win Monroe first, and we'll talk about Zimbabwe later. I mean, that's what our spiritual leadership does. They're not here to crush us and dissuade us. They're here to, okay, if that's really what God intends for you, we'll get in that direction sooner or later. But for right now, let's concentrate on teaching you how to win. people to the Lord and how to do Bible studies and things like that. But if you have the right attitude, the Lord will find a way to get you there, if that's really your calling. So, interesting. This whole lesson brought back so many ideas and things about development. I absolutely am thrilled to death with Brother Lucas and Brother Preston for the next gen men, which is what, 4 to 11? Is that the age group? 4 to 11. And they're calling them next gen men. And they're teaching them. There are spiritual lessons, but really it's working with your hands. There are other dads, like Josh Lanquist is part of that. He's got a couple boys in there and stuff. So these are young men that are being taught woodworking and cutting wood and screwing them together and gluing them and staining them. And they presented on Mother's Day last week birdhouses that they built. And they've got another project going up there right now, up in the educational building. And so they're working with the young men, teaching them, not just skills and trying to, all the moms are, hey, when I get my son back, I want 10 fingers, 10 toes. You're dealing with power stuff up there. That's what they want. And the men are saying, no, I need to be teaching something to them. I need to teach skills to them. I mean, if you take a look at Jesus, when he was just a young kid, he was still God wrapped in flesh, but Joseph said, no, I've got to teach you a skill. Take a look at Paul sitting at the feet of Gamaliel, because he is going to be one of the high muckety-mucks in the religious world of the Jews until God got a hold of him on the road to Damascus. That was his calling, to be a high muckety-muck. And he was doing well. He sat at the feet of Gamaliel. But God had a different plan. So all the dads who have these young boys up there in that class are saying, let's teach them a skill and this and that. They may end up being a pastor, evangelist. Who knows? But let's get them a skill. Let's let them learn how to use their hands and things like that. So I love that whole course. So there's a story in here about this young boy who was growing up, and he did boy things. Rode bike, rollerblading, playing street hockey, playing basketball, doing all these different things, but he loved collecting baseball cards. And he collected a ton of them. And he would spend hours going through all these baseball cards, finding the ones that, hey, this one I'm keeping forever. This is one of they call him a GOAT, greatest of all time. This is the greatest catcher. This is the greatest pitcher. This is the greatest outfielder. This is the greatest batter. I mean, he's got them all lined up and categorized and everything else, and spent hours collecting them. As he began to mature, the Lord started talking to him about God things. And he was tugging at his heart. And he was still a child, a boy compared to me, but God kept tugging at him, saying, hey. Then he started hearing the pastor preach about, Sunday school teachers teach about, and other people talk about idols. And he's thinking, oh, I don't do idols, so, I've never bowed down to a statue, and I don't kiss statues. So I'm not susceptible to idolatry. I mean, come on, that's ludicrous. Until the Lord started tugging at his heart, saying, so how much time do you spend on those baseball cards? And he started realizing, you know what? Not just the time, but the veneration almost the worship of these sports idols, these baseball idols. Maybe I do have a problem with idolatry. And it got to the point where he said, you know what? As with any calling of God, there has to be a sacrifice of something. And so he gathered all of his baseball cards, took them in the backyard, and burned them. And I'm sure there were people that said, you have any idea how much those cards were worth? Some of those rookie cards and some of those, are you kidding me? But he made a decision. Okay, I've got God and I've got baseball cards. In the big scheme of life, what do you think is more important? He had no qualms about burning those. Now, you might think that's kind of a weird sacrifice in your backyard, burning them, but it was a line of demarcation that said, this is the line that I'm crossing over, away from this worldly stuff into this heavenly realm. Now, after that, he worked in the ministry. He got licensed. He was in Christian education. He pastored churches. He became a relatively big name in the Christian world, and he continued to walk with God and be a shining example to others. But it took that sacrifice for God to actually use him for what he wanted him to do. So if you have ideas to go up to the pastor today and say, I want to be a missionary to Zimbabwe, okay, he'll start working with you. He's not going to crush you. He'll start working with you, but he's going to require some things. That's going to be a sacrifice on your part. So here's the bottom line with this. The title of this was Success in Succession. And it's talking about transferring the mantle from Elijah to Elisha. I'll get it here in a minute. And that was not an easy thing for either one of them. It both required a very change in direction on their paths. Even though Elijah was already working with God and everything else, it required him to now use his knowledge, skills, and abilities and transfer that to Elisha. And Elisha gave up everything he knew to do that, to follow Elijah. And so you can see story after story after story where people gave up everything. I mean, take a look at Abraham. I want you to leave Ur of the Chaldees. I want you to leave your land, your family, your friends, your schooling, everything you know, and walk that way. Where am I going? You just go that way and I'll tell you where to go. That's a commitment. I know every service you'll see prayer lists up there, and one of them is missionaries. People have done the same thing. They left everything. Why? Because God told them to. So if you have a calling to be a missionary in Zimbabwe, go for it. But make sure a couple things. Nobody ever starts a ministry ever without being sent. You go out there on your own, you're on your own. You have no umbrella of protection. But if you have the backing of the church and the backing of your spiritual leadership, you will be awesome in the world of missionaries. But you have to be sent. You have to have the patience to let the spiritual authority over you teach you, work with you, strengthen you, and then you will be used. So let's all stand before the Lord. Lord, I'm so very thankful. I'm so very thankful, Lord, that in your wisdom you see our weaknesses and where we need to be strengthened. I'm so very thankful, Lord, that you keep your hand on us and you guide us and and woo us in the direction you want us to go, and you put the right people in the right place to help us get there. So right now, Jesus, I'm asking you to let your hand rest upon this congregation. And I'm asking you, Jesus, to bless those that were here, those that watched online. Bless them abundantly, Lord. Make the message clear in their heart. I'm asking all of this in Jesus' name. So right now it's 11:15. We're going to take a 15-minute break while the kids are coming up from Sunday school. The youth are coming down from Sunday school, and then we'll start our service at 11 o'clock. So turn around, shake somebody's hand, greet them in the name of the Lord.